Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. So our group presentation today is given to you by students and a professor from the University of Pittsburgh. They have done studies on from heavy metal music to Jamaican hip hop, and they're also continuing to work with digital songwriting, experimental composition, and comedy songwriting. So I present to you Marshall Pearson, Jason Belcher, Cullen Murphy, Kevin O'Brien, Brian Riordan, and Emerson Voss.
Good afternoon. In this paper, we're going to tell you about a class we're calling Creative Musicianship that teaches students about contemporary musical practices through creative projects, peer feedback, and group discussion. As you will see, we think creative musicianship is important because it brings creativity into non-music major offerings by working with DAW notation, DAW being digital audio workstations such as Reaper, Ableton, Logic Pro, or GarageBand, instead of 5-line staff notation. Throughout the semester, students use different technologies, music concepts, and instrumentation in their creations. At the conclusion of this course, students will have completed many original projects, both large and small, and developed skills in listening, evaluation, critique, creativity, and appreciation. These skills and assignments are grouped in 3 larger units. Unit 1, Making a Podcast, introduces students to music vocabulary and identification of form to aid in their discussion of music without the use of a score. Unit 2, Composing Music in a DAW, introduces students to working in a DAW while digging deeper into rhythm, pitch, chords, and song arrangement as resources in creating their first short but complete song. Unit 3, Composing with Recorded Sound, serves as a catalyst to broadly investigate timbre through experimenting with sampling, recording, and using their voices. Unit 3 concludes with a 2-week exploration of rap and flow, including discussion on the history of hip-hop, writing and producing original rap verses, and completing final projects that require students to utilize an assortment of skills gained throughout the semester in the completion and presentation of a full-length track. All of this is accomplished in 14 weeks by a class of almost exclusively non-music majors. These students exhibit a wide range of prior musical and creative backgrounds. Some students have participated in music throughout all of their early and secondary education. Some students in the beginning of semester surveys claim to, quote, not be creative whatsoever, end quote. But through creative musicianship, all are challenged to expand their sense of appreciation for music, learn technical language and music software, and create original music on a weekly and sometimes daily basis.
Hello. The course title, Creative Musicianship, draws on traditionally non-academic methods of making music with a spectrum of notation and/or input from composer-performers. AACM co-founder Wadada Smith is widely credited with coining the term creative music. In exploring this term, Smith defines creation as the process of making art in the present moment. Regarding the role of notation, he points to signs and symbols that are used by both composers and performers to generate hybrid works. Smith's definition of creative music emerged with the founding of the AACM in the mid-1960s. Many AACM members, and a range of other composer-performers have since taught and developed curricula at colleges, festivals, and community programs around the United States. Their writings and theories have concurrently been published in a range of formats. Today, a growing number of authors and organizations advocate for equity by teaching alternatives to traditional Western notation to a student body with a wide spectrum of backgrounds, training, and music-making experience. As such, it is useful to examine some of the resources and institutions where curricula and/or pedagogy for creative music making have been previously developed. In each listed resource you see above, authors were careful to include input from a diverse pool of music makers in their own words. This approach facilitates a range of composition methods, exploration of musical genre, and personal backgrounds that are often unaccounted for, and Western music theory texts and university core curricula.
Creative musicianship is geared toward non-majors and gen ed students. It fulfills some important gen ed requirements at our institution, including one called creative work, and this has helped enroll the course to capacity in even its first semester. There are two main premises that made this course feel necessary, and I went a little crazy with the animations here, but the first is that musical creativity is important, and that's true even for non-majors. The second premise is that musical notation should not serve as a barrier to creativity. I'd like to discuss each of these premises in a bit more detail. So the first premise, that musical creativity is important, was articulated by the authors of the so-called CMS Manifesto. The manifesto identifies 3 core deficiencies in current music undergrad curricula, one of which is, quote, the subordination of the creation of new work to the interpretive performance of older work, end quote. Part of the reasoning has to do with the increasingly scarce career opportunities for interpreting pre-existing work, which is less relevant for our non-major population. But part of it also has to do with creativity being a central part of musicianship, one that is often de-emphasized in the conservatory model. Paul Broomhead, a prolific theorist of musical literacy, identifies creativity as one of the 4 orientations that should be in thoughtful balance in music instruction. These orientations are creator, performer, responder, which is sort of an expanded take on listener, and then the 4th one is connector, which is sort of like a thinker, someone who thinks about music. Broomhead encourages curriculum designers to develop competencies in each of these 4 orientations. In an explanation about why each is essential, he says, those who do not engage in creating music are deprived of deep personal meaning that comes as unspoken expressions of the inner life are realized in the material world. Many instructors in the theory core include creative assignments in the form of model composition, but it's rarer in non-major or gen ed classes. These classes often take the form of music appreciation, including world music courses, intro music history courses, things like that, which emphasize responder and connector orientations. Or they might take the form of performance classes, which obviously emphasizes the performer orientation. Creative musicianship emphasizes the creator orientation the most, but much of the class is also taken through building the responder orientation as well. Because as students learn to make, they must also learn to listen and articulate musical ideas through words. Non-majors also often end up in so-called fundamentals classes that teach them how to read 5-line staff notation. Creative musicianship actually developed as an alternative to fundamentals for non-majors. My personal stance is that such fundamental classes should be geared towards students who plan on using notation actively in their musical lives, and that gen ed students who are merely interested in broadening their knowledge about music would be better off taking a music appreciation, like one of these kind of other courses. This involves rethinking what the fundamentals of music actually are, which leads naturally to our second premise, that musical notation has the potential to serve as a barrier to creativity, and that we shouldn't let that happen, especially for non-majors. Musical literacy is often equated with the ability to read 5-line staff notation. As a number of authors have pointed out, this stems from the Academy's assumed default of classical music, which in turn is part of the white framing that Phil Ewell has recently brought into the general consciousness. You can see this bias playing out in the idea that the fundamentals of music theory would be facility with 5-line staff notation. And just as a caveat, this is still called fundamentals at Pitt. It's just beginning to feel a little bit outdated that this is like what fundamentals is or should be of music. Traditional music theory sequences assume that students who want to write music have, if not a background in musical notation, at least a future with it. This then bleeds out into gen ed curricula. There's a parallel with literature here, where students must learn vocabulary and grammar before they can start writing stories. In music, these building blocks include clefs, intervals, metrical notation, etc. Just think about what must go into writing this not very interesting measure of music, and I'm going to play it now just to show how not interesting it is. We heard the second. You get the idea. We're not going to troubleshoot that. Okay. So this might take like an entire semester of work in fundamentals. We've got treble clef, we've got bass clef, we've got rhythmic notation, including dots, we've got triads, we've got seventh chords, we've got keyboard spacing, maybe we've even got some voice leading in there. We can and do teach our students to make something like this in like a week of kind of working with DAWs rather than 5-line staff notation. There's an idea in literacy studies that students first learn to read and then read to learn. An imperfect translation into music places 5-line staff literacy as the fundamental skill for music theory. Students must read music on the 5-line staff before they can write music. The 5-line staff carries baggage, however, and we're going to hear about this in all kinds of ways at this conference. So in our call for an expanded definition of musical literacy in the theory core, Rosa Abrams points out that music that isn't easily notated in the 5-line staff is either impossible to bring into the analysis classroom or is significantly distorted by transcription. One solution is to think of a DAW as a form of notation. And you can see here, this is like a piano roll on a DAW, so you can kind of see how that might work as notation. Robert Davidson, for instance, advocates for thinking of DAW interfaces as notation that is sometimes more effective than 5-line staff notation in how it can show timbre, automation, things like that. In terms of teaching creativity, a DAW's interface is more intuitive than the 5-line staff, which flattens the learning curve significantly and allows students to make music that sound good to them much sooner. Jettisoning 5-line staff notation for DAW notation thus actually makes it easier to compose within many vernacular genres that aren't ever notated to begin with. In our class, this includes verse-chorus song structures, rap verses, assemblage compositions, and beats made with samples. Many of the student works created through these processes would be like impossible to notate, actually. Like I would not be able to notate them on the 5-line staff. And this is probably why there's so many successful musicians out there today pursuing careers without using 5-line staff notation. So in our curriculum, some students do go on to take fundamentals to deepen their understanding of music. Some move on to some of these other gen ed courses that you see up on the screen that don't necessarily rely on notation. And some students don't continue to take classes with us. That's the nature of our gen ed students. But we're confident that they've gained a better sense of themselves as musicians and artists, as well as a greater appreciation for what goes into making the music they like to listen to. So next, our colleague Kevin O'Brien, who couldn't be here today, you're gonna see him on the video here, and he's gonna give a rundown of the weekly rhythm of the class so you can kind of get a sense of it. You ready?
The following representative sample lessons coincidentally come from the unit on sampling. The two 75-minute classes comprising this unit further competencies in responder, connector, and creative orientations. Students familiarize themselves with the definitions and historical context of sampling, analyze examples, and practice using samples in their own creative projects. At 9 weeks into the semester, students know each unit begins by downloading and filling in a vocabulary sheet. Selected vocabulary derives from that in use in contemporary production, e.g. breaks, so students can recognize the relevance. Terms are defined in lecture, and students submit their sheets for a completion grade. This serves multiple functions, providing a structure for note-taking, ensuring engagement with the lectures, assessing comprehension, and furnishing students with a resource for later review, vital in a course with no set text. This lesson features several short videos which break up the monotony of lecture and grant an opportunity to give actual artists a voice. Students should not only recognize that sampling comes from Black and Latin artists, but also hear from these practitioners. After exposure to famous examples, students analyze the use of samples in other tracks. Differing discussion prompts help guide inquiry. This includes pointed technical questions like identifying loop or one-shot samples, which serve as an immediate means of assessing comprehension and application of terminology, and more open-ended solicitations of students' opinions, which prime forethought into their own creative use of samples in the first creative activity. Designed for non-music majors, This course carefully scaffolds every activity, easing interaction, providing a structure for developing specific skills, and reducing the potentially intimidating prospect of crafting original compositions. For this activity, students layer samples into an existing beat. Instructors demonstrate how to download samples from the searchable database freesound.org, just one of the myriad free online resources used across the semester. At first, students only use unpitched samples, further simplifying the process by keeping students focused on one skill set in their DAWs and avoiding the complication of also learning about pitch correction until later. Instructors may also place additional parameters on the activity, like limiting choices to claps or heys, ensuring students master the process without getting lost in infinite possibilities. Nevertheless, creativity thrives in limitations, as evidenced when students share their widely varying compositions with the class. Working from the same constraints, students can also provide peer feedback with great facility. Day 2 incorporates some review in the form of analyzing more examples, but leaves time for experiential participatory learning. Each week culminates in an in-class creative project. In this group activity, students replace parts of a basic beat with samples. Here, students have more freedom of choice, but also the recommendation of selecting their samples from within a theme, like Run the Jewels' use of cat sounds in their remix, Meowly. Seemingly silly, the use of humor eases group interaction and encourages active participation by avoiding the paralysis that comes with the paradox of choice. Further criteria make sure students explore the capabilities of their DAWs and hone skills learned in earlier units. These focused, scaffolded creative projects provide them with the proficiency in the necessary skills for larger compositions.
From its conception to its current form, creative musicianship has featured DAW-based musical projects that eliminated the need to teach particular elements of music theory by way of exams and exercises. What has not remained consistent these past 2 years while making creative musicianship is the form, flow, and number of these creative projects. We met weekly for 1 hour across 4 semesters to make the best version of the course we could. During the first semester in fall 2020, pairs of instructors would take turns fleshing out each week's outline from the syllabus. The second semester's meetings followed the same format with the added benefit of already having a lesson plan to critique. The third semester focused on shifting the class from online to in-person. During the fourth semester, the meetings were cut to 30 minutes and edits to the lesson plans were made only if necessary. During this time, the lesson plans were finalized and polished. 30-minute weekly meetings will continue in the semesters to come, and this will allow student teachers to continue to update and polish the course, as well as express their concerns and share their successes throughout the semester. As student teachers interact and share, they gain an understanding of how a music course is constructed. Student feedback was also accounted for twice each semester. In addition to the standard student evaluations at the end of the semester, we implemented a midterm student evaluation each semester using an anonymous Google form. All course materials that students interact with are in one baseline Canvas course that each instructor can copy and edit according to their class's needs. A shared folder contains all the lesson plans as well. Our collaborative approach to creative musicianship strikes a balance between support and flexibility. For instance, lesson plans and online course materials are thorough, including, for instance, links to YouTube videos of songs for each excerpt. But instructors are also free to choose their own musical examples and are encouraged to share their students' responses. The breadth of creative musicianship's course material, covering from, for example, rapping, beat making, assemblage, podcasting, etc., required many areas of expertise. Collaboration between instructors was important. It enabled us to tap into each other's strengths, and all of us were free to share ideas for what we thought would make for a better course. This freedom to share has made the course much better over its now 2-year run. The course started with 5 units, and now it has 3. At first, the term creative was implemented much more broadly. Students were making homemade instruments and drafting graphic scores, as well as writing and recording a rap and creating assemblage compositions. We cut both homemade instruments and graphic scores, and after cutting these projects, all projects could be completed within a DAW. And this tightened focus on working within DAWs gave students a consistent flow and stable infrastructure for their learning. Another major improvement to the course was to introduce what we termed the woo-woo examples, only after we had used popular music examples. So for us, woo-woo meant more experimental or abstract, what one might find in an academic music compositional setting. And the reason for this consideration was both ethical and pedagogical. So ethically, it seemed unfair to force students to initially work with examples that often take on a certain more exclusive musical training to appreciate if they don't have the means to get that training or were not surrounded by it during their formative years. And pedagogically, there was no significant difference in the ability of concepts to be drawn from the woo-woo as from the popular music examples, except that the popular music examples had the advantage of being more accessible and making this made for a smooth transition to the woo-woo. So choosing a DAW or DAWs to use for creative musicianship was a long process. And now we're going to hear from my colleague Brian Riordan about what we ended up choosing in the end.
For creative musicianship, we chose to use BandLab as our DAW, which is a free, cloud-based digital audio workstation. This requires no installation, and anyone with access to the internet can use it. It even has a mobile app. BandLab has a professional workflow that mimics industry-standard DAWs. It comes with a large quantity of virtual synthesizers, drum machines, and has a sample editor. It has a piano roll, which we use to teach scales and chords, a tempo grid with time signatures for teaching rhythm, can easily copy and paste regions to teach form, additional effects plugins for teaching timbre, and it even allows for the recording of a microphone or an instrument into any track. For the above reasons, we opted out of using free DAWs like Reaper and Audacity, which would require students and teachers to deal with complex installation and file management procedures, and potentially take away time from learning about music. There's an educational version of BandLab that we used, which could be found at edu.bandlab.com. This version allows for teachers to create assignments and to share with each other, and it's very easy for students to submit and receive feedback and grades.
Creative musicianship was developed to bring musical creativity to non-music majors. Through a combination of student input, trial and error, and colleague collaboration, this class has made significant changes over its 2-year existence. This class development process allowed us to create units and projects that we believed would be relevant to students without a classical music background, and will allow us the flexibility to adapt and incorporate new topics in the future. Similarly, creative musicianship offers all students an opportunity to start their music-making journey without notation and provides them the tools to confidently explore any subsequent musical path. Thank you.
Thank you for this. My name is Daniel Borolski. My question is, if we were to ignore the dirty bureaucratic politics of departments and all that goes with it, could you envision a second or third course that builds off of this? And can you give some sense of what that might look like?
Yeah, I haven't thought of that.
And who might take it? And like, where would it fit within majors or not?
Oh, I'm repeating the question too. Yeah, the question was about, could we imagine a kind of subsequent course of creative musicianship 2, and what would that look like? I have not thought about this because of our own dirty politics, but I don't know if any of you have ideas about this.
Yeah. I think, some of the things that we ended up kind of leaving out, not leaving out, but condensing and maybe cutting a little bit, like the graphics score unit, the homemade instrument unit. I mean, homemade instruments could be an entire class in itself. And also, this class, the way it ended up, we focused a lot on, as we called it, notation in a DAW. But I think maybe exploring other types of notation, and also maybe live performance too, would be a good second and third and possibly fourth class. And that one, if it were up to me, we'd force all of our music majors to take it, and it would change their lives. Anybody?
Any more questions? Who do you want me to go to?
I just choose someone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I had a question. Do you have any samples of student work that you would be willing to share for a moment or two?
Yeah, we do, but not ready to share. But we can, be in touch about that. Yeah, that was something that we were gonna do, but we had to cut it here. But yeah, they make some really amazing stuff. So I don't know if anybody wants to describe an example, like a student sample.
I don't know, this just happened. We actually did in class, rap verses that we wrote in class, and one student talked about what it was like to be a shorter male student, and that was really deep, and the class was really moved, and that just happened in class, and these students are really engaging with that unit, and I don't know, the raps have I've cried multiple times, and I've laughed really hard. I don't know, it's just really moving to see the students do that kind of stuff.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. This looks like a great class. I was on the curriculum committee during our Gen Ed revamp, and one of the things that other majors had were these introductory classes that would take people who didn't know what they wanted to major in, give them an introduction to what it's like, and then pull them into the major. It's an interesting thing, I think, that staff notation is such a barrier to students who don't come to us with years of musical experience, but maybe they've experienced something like this and they want to have a music career. So, thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say a lot of our students have years of musical experience without staff notation too. That's what I think we find in these classes is just that it kind of draws in a variety of musical backgrounds as well. I don't know if this is on.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. My question is about the level of experience of the non-major students. It looked like you had some MIDI inputs, I presume from a MIDI controller, and if so, how did you navigate people working at a keyboard who might not have had any experience with that before?
So in that regard, that is also a really wide variety of, talking about students who come to us with backgrounds that are not necessarily in staff notation, a lot of them have played around with drum pads and MIDI instruments that, for them, the organizational workflow is much more conducive to them. And the way that I personally try to open this up to those students is talking about making the pathways really clear to them of, this is what we're doing during the course of this class, so we're gonna really focus on the piano roll as a means to teach you a little bit more about scales and chord progressions, but if this is sounding familiar to you and you have this interest and, oh, I want to use this, I have this MIDI controller that I want to bring in here, but I don't quite know how to hook it up with BandLab, making those paths clear so that we can talk about those outside of the class, or that's what we use our student hours for, or our email is always open, trying to encourage that we know that those connections are possibly there, and to let us know so that we can cater to those individual students and those specific experiences.
Thank you. We don't have any more time for questions for them, but you are always welcome to come up and ask them later informally. And while they're taking down, I will introduce our next speaker. Okay, so our next presenter is a doctoral candidate in music theory at McGill University. She currently holds the Joseph Armand Bombardier Canada Graduate Scholarship from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and is not only a winner of the Innovative Learning and Teaching in Music Award, but is a two-time winner in the Innovative Learning and Teaching in Music Award. So, whenever she's ready, please welcome Alexandria Yonker.
I'm going to play a short two-part excerpt on a piano. It's in E major and in 3/4. I want you to memorize the bass line and sing it back using note letter names. Okay, E major, 3/4. It's very short. If you can also memorize the soprano, go for that. I know I'm asking a lot of you. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, E major. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Beautiful. And how about the soprano line? Did we memorize that also? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Beautiful. This activity is what we at McGill call proto-dictation, and it's exactly what we did with our students in the core ear training curriculum in the 2020 to 2021 school year while we were teaching remotely. It also aligns with what I've termed a blind hearing classroom, based on Joe Strauss's conception of blind hearing. I first presented this idea of the blind ear training classroom last fall at the National Society for Music Theory conference. And unsurprisingly, most of the questions I received were about logistics. How can I make this work in my classroom? So today, I'm going to show and tell you how it worked for us at McGill. My talk today will start with a brief introduction to blind hearing and the ways blind students have traditionally been accommodated in the ear training and music theory curricula. Next, I will give an overview of what McGill's musicianship program looks like before diving into how we implemented notation-free dictation as a step toward the blind hearing classroom, including the learning objectives for this new approach to melodic dictation, assessment strategies, examples of the materials we used, and videos from my own class demonstrating students taking part in both individual assessments and group practice scenarios. Finally, I'll conclude with some of the difficulties we encountered, including time constraints and students' limited musical memory, and how these obstacles were overcome. In his book, Extraordinary Measures, Disability in Music, Strauss classifies blind hearing as the methods that blind musicians use to learn, understand, and listen to music and participate in music making. Quote, blind people are often tracked into musical activities, and there's a long history of distinguished blind musicians in all times and places. One shared feature is that for blind musicians and blind listeners generally, the experience of music is usually not mediated by notation. For experienced, classically trained musicians then, notation-based hearing is normal hearing. Blind hearing, on the other hand, is unmediated by notation. Due to the deeply ingrained normal notation-based hearing methods we are accustomed to, instructors in the academy are often ill-equipped to teach students with visual impairments. The 15th volume of Music Theory Online, published in 2009, is dedicated to music and disability, with articles by Sherston Johnson, David Packen, Jana Saslaw, and John Kochavi, all outlining their experiences and methods for teaching blind music students. Two common threads are pervasive throughout. Blind students are typically segregated from the rest of the class, so everyone else can continue to complete notation-based activities like sight singing and dictation. And they're often strongly encouraged, if not required, to learn Braille notation. These authors also point out the problems with these accommodations. Students often learn better when learning alongside their peers, and most blind musicians don't actually use Braille notation in their day-to-day musical activities. Despite knowing these methods are ineffective and riddled with complications, instructors continue to use them due to lack of other alternatives. In my own research, I've presented a third possibility from a universal design perspective. Instead of making accommodations for individual blind students, perhaps instead we could remove the barrier, in this case notation, from our ear training curricula, and focus on the development of more acute aural abilities unmediated by a score. My approach is rooted in Strauss's conception of blind hearing. As Strauss points out, more than just blind musicians learn music without notation. Quote, "If we think about music globally, including non-Western and popular music, we realize that notation-based hearing, or music making generally, is very much the minority. What I'm calling blind hearing is statistically far more common than notation-based hearing," end quote. By focusing on the skills required to learn and make music without notation, such as musical memory and a more tactile and embodied approach to music making, I suggest that we can not only include those with visual impairments in our classrooms without individual accommodations, but we can also improve the aural abilities of all of our students. Sight singing and melodic dictation are two of the most common activities pursued in our traditional ear training classrooms. Both of these activities rely on notation and need to be rethought for the blind ear training class. In what follows, I'll explain how we at McGill transformed our traditional approach to melodic dictation to remove the visual components in order to complete these activities entirely aurally. But first, a quick detour to give you an overview of what McGill's musicianship program looks like. All of our undergraduate music majors, with the exception of jazz students, are required to take 4 semesters of core musicianship, plus an additional upper year elective. Each of the core classes have 6 to 7 sections containing a maximum of 12 students and sometimes as few as 5 students per section. All sections are taught by different instructors, but the curriculum and schedule are coordinated across sections by a small team consisting of Peter Schubert, Justin Mariner, and recently myself. These classes are separate from the written theory curriculum and keyboard proficiency courses, and they focus on 5 main skills scaffolded across the entire sequence: prepared singing, sight singing, play and sing, improv, and dictation. When the pandemic hit and McGill announced the 2020 to 2021 school year would take place entirely remotely, instructors were encouraged to think creatively about learning objectives and the use of class time. While we could easily see many of our learning activities, such as sight singing, improvisation, and play and sing, taking place over Zoom, we were stuck with what to do about dictation. We were concerned about how students would submit their written answers, and we were worried about academic integrity if they weren't submitting their hard copies. We decided that if we removed the need for students to write down their answers, we'd be simultaneously solving both of these issues. At this point, we had to take a step back and think about what exactly we want our students to achieve during dictation. Is our goal with these activities to have students turn sound into notation, or is our goal something else? We decided we're more concerned with students' ability to understand aural stimuli, and that written notation is just one of many ways they could demonstrate their understanding of the musical patterns they hear. Singing back the tune using scale degrees or fixed do solfege or note letter names, in our opinion, demonstrates the same understanding. If a student can sing back a melody using note letter names and conducting to show metrical position of notes, they could likely also turn it into notation. This sort of sing-back activity already had a precedent in our program. In our melody continuation improv activities, students listen to a 2-measure melodic incipit, sing it back on a neutral syllable, and add a 2-measure continuation, and often other students in the class are then asked to sing back the entire 4-measure tune using fixed do solfege. We also do a lot of sing back during our traditional dictation activities, where instructors have the entire class sing back the heard melody on a neutral syllable and ensure the excerpt is memorized before students write anything down. The next step in this process was determining what the learning objectives actually were for this activity. Instead of translating sound into symbol, we wanted our students to sing back excerpts in their appropriate key by using fixed do solfege. This overarching goal contains 3 sub-goals. First, students need to be able to memorize 2 or 4 or 8 measure melodies in order to sing them back. Second, students must be able to map what they're hearing to a key signature and compute the memorized melody into fixed do solfege. And third, they must be able to sing it back while conducting to demonstrate metric and rhythmic understanding of the melody. After determining what we were assessing, we next had to decide how we were going to assess it. Unlike your traditional dictation, where all students write down the same melody simultaneously, a sing-back dictation would have to be completed differently. 2 options arose. Either every student would need a new melody, or students would have to be tested individually. Due to our small class sizes and the encouragement from our teaching and learning services team to reimagine the use of class time and contact hours, we came up with a plan. Each semester would be divided into some number of 2D classes, where all of the students were present on Zoom at the same time to practice activities together, learn new content, and perform for their peers. And the rest of the classes would be individual lessons, where students would show up for 8-minute, one-on-one micro lessons with the instructor for some sort of assessment. In our first-year classes, 2D class weeks alternated with individual lesson weeks. In the second-year classes, there were 4-week cycles that contained 1 2D week and 3 individual lesson weeks. In this system, we were able to practice proto-dictation as a group during 2D weeks, discussing strategies and working together, while assessing students individually on their proto-dictation activities and removing the need to have many different excerpts for each test. With a strong emphasis on musical memory in these proto-dictation activities, we decided to take a more holistic approach to grading. Instead of grading each individual note as right or wrong, as one would on a written dictation, we decided to grade students on the number of listenings it took for them to memorize and sing back the tune correctly. The following grading scale is what we used for assessing our students. If students used 2 or less listenings, they got 100%, which is an A. 3 listenings, 84%, or an A-. 4 listenings was a 79% or a B+. 5 listenings was 74% and a B. 6 listenings was 69%, which is a B-. And more than 6 listenings, we passed them. In later semesters, when students had to memorize and sing back 2 parts, a melody and a bass line, each part was given a grade based on the number of listenings, and the 2 grades were averaged together. We really wanted students to be able to try things and self-correct, rather than waiting until they had memorized and converted the entire melody to solfege before performing anything. Allowing students to sing whatever they could remember between listenings without fear of losing points for incorrect pitches also gave instructors the opportunity to help guide their listening by getting them to focus on the parts they were singing incorrectly. For the students who found this type of dictation difficult, we also encouraged them to get to the final answer in a series of steps. First, they could focus on memorizing the tune and sing it back on a neutral syllable. Then they could take an intermediate step and convert the tune to scale degrees before finally translating it into the correct key and singing it back using fixed do solfege. You can see one of my students working through this process in the following video. Immediately before the video starts, the student was told the key, B flat major, the time signature, 2/4, and the number of measures to expect in this excerpt, 3 measures. The student was in my second semester class, where we focus on bass lines. So although they were hearing a 2-part excerpt, they were only required to memorize and sing back the bass. While we watch, note that the student's conducting doesn't line up with the heard audio due to Zoom latency issues, but it gets resolved when he sings the excerpt himself.
All right, here we go.
Okay, can I hear it again?
Yep, your first interval sounds good.
Okay. Okay. 3, 1, 5. Can I
Yep.
have one more listen?
Yep. You're doing good. Your scale degrees for the first and the last measure are good. You just need to fill in that blank of the second measure. Here we go.
3, 1, 4, 3, 5.
Super close. Your second last note isn't a 3.
3, 1, 4. Okay, one more time.
Yep.
Three, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5.
Not a 1 either.
It's a 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 4, 2, 5.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
So re, si, fa, do. No, re, si, sol, do.
Just take a second and think about it before you sing it.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Re, si, mi, do, fa.
Yeah, beautiful.
Okay.
That was great.
Based on our grading scale, the student received a B+ on this assessment. This example was pretty typical for what we expected from our second semester students. Examples were 2 or 3 measures long. They followed conventional tonal patterns and progressed throughout the semester from less active basslines to ones with slightly more rhythmic interest. As you also heard, the audio file was MIDI rather than performed by me, the instructor. Since we have so many sections and different instructors across the sequence, we wanted there to be consistency from section to section. So we decided to pre-record all of the excerpts, which were then played for students by sharing audio over Zoom. The audio recording played a tonic triad at the beginning, followed by the starting pitch for the voice the student had to memorize, and then a count-in before the excerpt started. We also took this opportunity to include sounds other than the piano in our ear training curriculum. Instead, all of the audio files contained a bass voice played by a MIDI cello and a soprano voice played by a MIDI flute. Although MIDI isn't always the greatest sound, I was happy to have something other than piano in our very piano-centric class. In third and fourth semesters, the examples followed the same format, but with increased difficulty. In third semester, students had to memorize and sing back both the bass and soprano parts of 4-measure excerpts, most of which were Handel minuets and a couple of 1890s popular songs. And in fourth semester, they continued memorizing and singing 2-part 4-measure excerpts that were now more rhythmically and tonally complex, containing modulations and chromatic harmony. These examples were all taken from songs by Florence Price, Fanny Hensel, and Clara Schumann. Here's another video, this time of what the process was like in a practice 2D class. You'll see that I had a very small class that semester, only 5 students, 4 of whom showed up on a regular basis. While I know most of you teach classes larger than this, the tactics I used could still be applied with more students in the class.
Okay, here we go. I'll warn you, there's a tricky tie in here. Does anybody think they could sing it now? I won't ask you to sing it after the first one, but yeah, Nicholas, you think you could? Right. I'll give another listening. Here it is again. think they can do it after 2 listening? Mark thinks he can, Ben thinks he can. Ryan, you other 2? Yeah. Does somebody want to sing it for us?
Could I do it with numbers?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. 1 7 6 5 1.
Super, super close. What was Amar's mistake?
Instead of a E, he sang a C on that second to last note.
Yeah, exactly. The second last note you had a 5 and it's actually another 7. Does somebody else want to sing it using solfege?
I can try.
Yeah, sure.
Fa, mi, re, mi, fa.
Beautiful. Yep, exactly right. Nice.
In a 2D class, everyone listens together, and I tried to gauge when we were ready to hear an answer based on the number of students who reported they were ready. In this class, as you saw, I had one student offer to sing the bass line on scale degrees first, and got the other students involved with error detection before having another student translate it to solfege. In other larger classes, I would often ask first for a student who wasn't super confident in their answer to share whatever they could remember, and give them the choice to sing it back using a neutral syllable, scale degrees, or solfege. This allowed me to get more students involved and check in first with the students who were struggling before getting the right answer. As you could see, this activity didn't take much time, and we were often able to get through multiple examples in one class so I could hear from several students. While the videos I showed represent some successes in my class, we also faced difficulties implementing this approach in our curriculum. Besides the issue of time constraints, which we reconciled through the use of individual lessons, one of the other major difficulties we encountered was the limits on our students' musical memories and cognitive loads. In our past traditional dictation curricula, our second semester students were dictating 8-measure bass lines. At the beginning of our remote year, we tried using the same materials and realized very quickly that students were not able to memorize 8 measures of music without visual cues. When we first tried this, our students often couldn't remember more than 1 or 2 notes at a time. So in response, we shortened the excerpts to 2 or 3 measures. We also allowed students to use the keyboard as an oral assistance to help them figure out the melody and memorize it. While we were firm that we didn't want students to use notation, we decided that the keyboard was a good tactile and oral tool that would simulate the way a lot of folks do transcriptions before, during, and after university. The pianos were particularly helpful in 3rd and 4th semesters, when the excerpts got a bit longer and more chromatic. In closing, I'd like to bring us back to the idea of blind hearing and student inclusivity. As more diverse student populations with various backgrounds in music training, different abilities, and different learning preferences enter our classrooms, we have to start rethinking our traditional approaches to classroom activities. While the blind hearing approach to dictation I presented today maybe isn't truly universal in its design, I think it's a good step forward in getting students to listen deeply and recreate what they hear in a way that demonstrates their understanding of musical patterns. Not only does this approach allow students who are visually impaired to take part in classroom activities, but it's also more inclusive for those who have limited knowledge of and use for notation, such as those composing with DAWs and those trained in popular music traditions. As we continue to expand our canon to include music from other cultures and traditions, our need for Western music notation lessens. I hope today's presentation has given you some ideas for how you might approach dictation from a notation-free perspective. Thank you.
We will now use this time for questions.
Really, really wonderful presentation. Thank you. I have a 2-part question. Number 1, did you have any written assessments at all in this course? And number 2, if you did not, how did you handle harmonic dictation, if in fact you did anything with harmonic dictation?
Yeah, great questions. So we did have some notation in our class. In my ideal world, we would have gotten rid of all notation, but we're not quite at that point yet. So we still did sight singing from a score. We still did play and sing, which is from a score. We still did harmonic dictation. Actually, in this year, we did harmonic dictation without notation also. We do kind of maybe a strange version of harmonic dictation where we do mystery chords, so they only have to tell us what the predominant chord is. And we go through them kind of methodically, and they only have certain options for each test, but that's our version of harmonic dictation. And actually, since then, we've cut harmonic dictation entirely from our curriculum, so yeah. Yeah, over here.
Yeah, I'll echo. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking presentation. I'm curious, have you implemented any of this into the classroom? Because this was obviously devised as kind of a COVID solution, online Zooming. Have you done some more in-person? I mean, what does this look like once you have all your students resuming in the classroom? Because it'd be nice to preserve some of these things. And this is kind of where my school is at, where we're in the classroom, but I like the idea of trying to bring a lot of this into that. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, great question. So we are back to fully in-person teaching this past year. And unfortunately, we also went back to the old way that we did dictation. And I think after seeing what it was like this past year, I think things will be very different now that we have like a side-by-side A-B comparison of what these are like. Next year, we're already working on what our curriculum will look like for next year, and there's going to be a lot less notation, a lot more improv activities without notation, and going back to this version of melodic dictation without notation, because it's so interesting seeing those students who, you know, in this particular year, the second year students were very against this. Like, what do you mean I can't write this down? What do you mean I can't even have a pencil in my hand? Like, this isn't dictation. And some of them would like be sneakily trying to write it, and I'm like, I can see you, your camera's on, and they were like still like trying, and once they bought into it, they were like, okay, I can see why. Our first year students were totally fine, they didn't know anything different. And then teaching second year this year with those students, really interesting to see, like when I actually told them to like put your pencil down and just memorize this, their memory was incredible. But as soon as they had that pencil in their hand, they were like, what do you mean I have to memorize this? I could just write it down right away. So it's really interesting to see that A-B comparison and thinking about how to move forward with this. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for another presentation that was just very thought-provoking for me. You mentioned using the keyboard as an oral assistant. Would students be able to use their primary instruments as well in the same way?
Yeah, good question. So this year, we required all of our students to have keyboards for the remote year, which we were expecting to get a lot of pushback from. And actually, I think only 5 students across our whole sequence had an issue with that, and we sent them keyboards from our school collection, and it was fine. So we decided that, you know, if we are asking them to purchase a keyboard, it's something that they could use in their theory classes, in their counterpoint classes, and can be used pretty widely, and we felt like it was a fairly decent investment for them to make. But I do think asking them to use their primary instrument, I think that would be a really interesting direction to go, to see kind of where this goes next. I had a student, while she was sight singing, she had her flute in her hands, and all of her recordings, I could hear the clicking of her keys. And when I asked her about it, she was like, oh, I'm sorry. And I was like, no, I just think that's really cool. And we had a discussion about it. She was like, yeah, I can sight sing way better if I'm holding my flute. So I think thinking about that, going forward with this, I think is a really interesting avenue also. Yeah. Okay. Definitely, yeah, and kind of taking this in the direction of like this blind hearing classroom, that's such a big part of a blind musician's way that they understand music is through that very like embodied tactile approach. So going in that direction even further with our sighted students, I think, and really tapping into that knowledge that they already have would be interesting.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, I hate to be that person. This is less of a question more than a comment, and not to say that your student was doing this, but I know with some instruments, especially woodwinds, Oh, mine's. Some of them, as you click them, will actually give you the tone as well.
Yeah.
So,
right.
just be cognizant. I'm not saying any student was doing that to
Yeah.
be harmful, but
Yeah.
I have colleagues who've done that in the past. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So there's lots of like pros and cons to think about with all of these approaches for sure.
That's all our time for questions for Alexandria. But once again, if you have more, talk to her. Meet people. That's what this is about. Okay, while our next presenter is setting up, I'm going to introduce them. He is an assistant professor at Rowan University, where he teaches music theory courses, and his current focus is on music theory pedagogy, obviously, anti-racist teaching, and the development of open educational resources. Please welcome Adam Kolick.
Check, check, check. Good. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Through this QR code, you can access the bibliography for the presentation and some of the materials I used in the course that I'll describe. And I'll provide that QR code again at the end of the presentation. The university curriculum in Western music theory requires that students possess a foundational knowledge of musical fundamentals and rudiments before entering the core theory sequence. A portion of our students arrive at college having mastered these skills. In most cases, these students have benefited from access to AP music theory or other high school courses, private music instruction, piano lessons, and other preparations that have enabled their achievement. Other students, however, enter our programs without a firm grasp on music fundamentals. Some of these students are highly talented and are accepted into our programs on the strength of their potential as performers. Others may be pursuing related music degrees, such as in music industry, that have NASM-required musicianship components. These may be accomplished musicians, but in styles outside of Western concert music or jazz. Together, they make up the roster of our remedial music theory classes, where they're expected to master in a single semester a body of knowledge and set of skills that other students have worked with for years. In many cases, even after completing remedial work, these students do not have the fluency necessary for high achievement in the core theory curriculum. They may pass their theory classes, but it will have been a struggle, with their failure to master the fundamentals a consistent impediment. As theory pedagogues, we are troubled by their lack of success. For decades, we have lamented that students do not come to college as prepared as they used to be. We look for better ways to identify students needing remedial work through more effective placement tests. Theory pedagogy literature contains numerous articles aimed at addressing the fundamentals gap through teaching tips, theory camps, computer-assisted instruction, peer tutoring, changes to the curricular sequence, and reevaluations of high school training. From our viewpoint, These students do not have something that other students have. They have a deficiency in their knowledge and skills that must be made up for before they can begin core theory. As a result of this way of thinking, these students suffer negative consequences. They are set back in their coursework, put off sequence relative to their classmates, and made to pay for remedial music courses that may not count towards their degree requirements. They may remain in residence for more than 4 years or be forced to undertake summer and J-term courses that are outside the typical curriculum. In the worst case scenario, despite taking remedial classes, these students never manage to get up to speed in the theory core and are unable to complete their major program. The deficit mindset that we have towards our students has parallels with a historical perspective towards education in general in the United States, one that views education as assimilation. Under this perspective, the goal of education was to uncritically instill in students the values, history, and worldview of the majority culture, namely that of the white middle class. The cultures and languages of racially minoritized students were seen as deficits that needed to be remediated so that students could conform to the societal and cultural norms of the majority. This perspective not only privileged students with majority backgrounds, but directly worked to erase and replace minority cultures. There are obvious historical examples of this, such as the forced removals of indigenous children to boarding schools in the US and Canada, but it is also manifested in the curricula, textbooks, heroes, histories, holidays, and teaching approaches of our country's educational system. Music theory's white racial frame is another representation of this same worldview. Assimilationist teaching was challenged by scholars of education who sought to improve outcomes for racially minoritized students. Critiques of education as assimilation, such as culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally sustaining pedagogy, seek approaches that value and sustain the cultural backgrounds of students while educating them for success, cultural competence, and the ability to critique social norms. At the core of these perspectives is asset pedagogy. In contrast to a deficit approach, which views students who don't possess the knowledge most valued by the dominant educational framework as deficient, an asset pedagogy proceeds from the skills students already possess and seeks ways to value their experiences and connect their culture to the material under study. In other fields, some of these practices have included teaching linguistical meaning through hip-hop lyrics, centering the language practices of non-native English speakers, and creating student-led performances that drew from their own cultural backgrounds and experiences. These practices not only lead to successful educational outcomes, but they also reinforce students' sense of self and community. This past fall, I was assigned to teach sight singing and ear training, a remedial oral skills course. I knew that the majority of the students in this class would be music industry majors who are required to complete Music Theory 1 as part of the musicianship component of their program, and in preparation are placed in both sight singing and ear training and music fundamentals, the remedial written theory class. In previous semesters, I had had many such students in Theory 1, where even after taking remedial courses, many would struggle on oral skills assignments. Teaching this course was an opportunity to try to work out a more effective approach. While asset pedagogy, in the context of culturally responsive or sustaining pedagogy, is aimed at improving educational outcomes for racially minoritized students, the approach also seemed relevant for the teaching of my music industry majors. Typically, these students would be seen as having music theory deficits. In my class of 12 students, only one reported comfort with reading staff notation. Only 4 of 12 had any singing experience, and only 2 of those had formal experience singing in choirs. While half had taken or were taking music fundamentals, 3 had no experience with theory, and 1 reported being bad at music theory. However, these students had a variety of musical experiences that we don't typically value in a traditional music program. For instance, all of my students had experience with digital audio programs, and nearly all said that they had produced or made beats. Several of the students DJ'd, half the class had guitar experience, and multiple students played other rock instruments such as drums or keyboard. In addition, they all shared a love of music, viewing it as an integral part of their identity, and were enthusiastically focused on achieving careers either as popular musicians or in music production. I identified 2 main assets that were common to the music industry majors in this group. First, they had all had experience with the graphical music notation common to DAW software. My students had made beats on programs such as GarageBand, Logic, and FL Studio. In these programs, a timeline of beats and measures runs across the top of the screen. When using onboard instrument sounds, audio in each track is shown graphically as a set of horizontal lines that show attack points and duration within that metrical network. Second, these students had a wealth of listening, composing, and performing experience in various rock and hip-hop derived popular styles that commonly feature quadruple simple meter and syncopated rhythms. I incorporated these assets into how I taught the course. Instead of teaching using staff notation, I elected to start the year using a simplified notational system that I referred to as box notation, which I constructed in a table in Google Docs. The top row of the notation shows beats and beat divisions. The boxes in the second row contain rhythm and pitch information. I had seen similar notation in percussion method books, such as this example from the book Kunga Drumming, which shows what the authors refer to as a box chart. The top row shows the beats and divisions, the middle row how the drum is hit on that beat, and the bottom row which hand to use. At this same conference 3 years ago, Mitchell Reiner's poster presentation showed something similar, used in that case as a template for students to transcribe the rhythm of hip-hop vocals. I considered other systems such as Gary Karpinski's proto-notation or Janine Brown's notehead shorthand, but went with box notation for several reasons. First was its similarity to the graphical display of DAW software. Second was its simplicity, which meant that it required almost no explanation before students could read from it. Third, it could be constructed and shared through Google Docs. From a template, I could generate numerous rhythmic patterns and simple melodies that could be used in class or for homework assignments. In addition to using box notation for the first portion of the course, I elected to begin the class using only quadruple simple meter. Box notation and quadruple simple meter thus became the framework through which I would introduce rhythm and pitch assignments in major and minor keys. I also aimed to have the class work with syncopated rhythms from the very beginning. Again, this was facilitated by both the students' experience with such rhythms and the clarity of how they are displayed in box notation. I gathered information about my students and their musical experiences in our first class through a lively ice-breaking discussion, which I aimed at affirming and valuing their experiences and creating a comfortable classroom climate. In the second class, we started working with rhythm and continued working only with rhythm through week 3, a period which, through a quirk in the semester schedule, only encompassed 4 class meetings. I began by describing meter through a pulse chart and emphasized embodiment of the beat and pulses through movement. We clapped 1 and 2 measure rhythmic loops and performed as individuals, in groups, and in duets. We worked with rhythms in various ways. I introduced them orally, either by having students repeat what I performed or by describing the metrical layout of a rhythm. We also performed from box notation. Students orally described rhythms and notated them in boxes. From the first class, we performed syncopated rhythms. For some exercises, I would use a click track, both to keep us in tempo and to provide a steady beat to be performed against. This was another practice that students were familiar with from their work with audio software. In week 4, I introduced the major scale in solfege. We practiced pitch patterns and short stepwise melodies in box notation. I showed students how to form major scales on the keyboard with whole and half steps. For the first half of the semester, we continued to work only in quadruple simple meter with 2-part divisions using box notations and solfege, working up through singing skips to do, mi, and sol. In the second part of the semester, we began using staff notation, initially only in 4/4 meter. Since some students had not even had a music fundamentals class, there was much to be introduced here. In addition to the basics of letter names and the staff, students needed to learn durational symbols, key signatures, clefs, and meter signatures. I kept things simple as much as possible. For several more weeks, we only worked in 4/4, used only key signatures up to 3 sharps and flats, and we worked in treble clef for 2 weeks before introducing bass clef. Since I hadn't assigned a text for the class, I generally used YouTube videos and other internet sources as resources for these topics. We also worked on notating dictations and staff notation. I first had students translate box notation into staff notation, and then assign them dictation homework that they would complete in both formats before progressing to only requiring staff notation. In the last 6 weeks of the semester, we covered duple and triple meter, beat values other than the quarter note, minor scales and keys, and compound meter. Through this time, students worked up to using staff notation for singing and dictation assignments. Whenever I introduced a new topic, however, I started in box notation and built more templates to use with 2 and 3 beat meter and compound meter. Of course, not everything in the class went according to my initial plan. We ended up spending too much time on some things and less time than I would have liked to on others, but we were able to cover everything that I would have wanted to cover if I taught the class traditionally. I found this curriculum to have several advantages and several limitations. First, box notation was especially helpful with syncopated rhythms. My students were able to read and perform syncopated rhythms on the first day of class, an accomplishment that would have not have been possible if we had been using staff notation. Staff notation requires students to identify the metrical position of notes by summing up a variety of durational symbols, including symbols such as dots and ties that can be used to notate equivalent rhythms. By using a notation that clearly indicates the alignment of notes and beats, students are able to progress immediately to feeling how a rhythm fits to a metrical framework. By using box notation, my class was able to concentrate immediately on issues related to vocal production, audiation, and musical understanding. Staff notation requires the beginning student to decode a myriad of unfamiliar symbols in order to perform necessary tasks that are preliminary to sight singing, such as identifying the scale degrees in a melody. By removing this barrier, students were immediately fluent readers of rhythms and scale degree and could focus on attaching sounds to the notation without needing to translate duration and pitch symbols. This also made it easier for me to locate the source of performance errors, as I knew, for instance, that an incorrectly sung pitch was not the result of a music reading error. While students still would make rhythm and pitch errors, when those occurred, the clear layout of the notation meant that there was no need for me to do much more than reinforce a correct performance. In all, this meant that by the time we began using staff notation, students had already worked on a number of musical skills. They had experience performing rhythms, including syncopated rhythms, sight singing, and taking dictation, all before working with staff notation. I was actually impressed with how well my students learned to read box notation. Later in the class, when I returned to box notation to introduce new metrical rhythm and pitch concepts, they were immediately able to perform the initial melodies. By the end of the course, I thought the students' overall progress with singing and musical understanding exceeded what I normally expected from music industry majors entering Music Theory 1. This curriculum also had several limitations. Box notation proved cumbersome in ways I didn't anticipate. For instance, it takes up much more space on the page than staff notation, and it took me more time to notate a melody in box notation in Google Docs than it would have in a notation program. I intended box notation to facilitate musical performance and understanding, and as stated earlier, I think it was effective in that regard. Achieving fluency with staff notation, however, remained an issue for my students, who even at the end of the semester struggled to decode rhythms and pitches and translate that into a correct musical performance. It could be that a system that more closely resembled staff notation would be a better scaffold towards fluency with reading. In addition, when we practiced notating rhythms and melodies in box notation, I always provided blank templates showing beats and divisions. A system that required students to produce their own metrical framework, such as proto-notation or notehead shorthand, probably would prove to be a more effective tool for students to use when learning to take dictation on the staff. Something that I may try in the future would be to give students blank grids where they would fill in their own beats and divisions. Asset approaches have much to offer our students. In addition to improving educational outcomes for students with non-traditional musical experiences, a reevaluation of the knowledge that is prerequisite to music theory study would open our classes to more students and eliminate roadblocks that prevent disadvantaged students from succeeding in music programs. Because the classes in the music theory core are gatekeeper courses, it is necessary to revise the core in order to succeed in increasing student diversity amongst our graduates and correspondingly in the population of music educators and music theorists. In this class, I applied a concept of asset pedagogy borrowed from culturally responsive or sustaining pedagogy. But to truly apply these methodologies in our classes, we would need to go much further. While this paper described a change to my pedagogical approach, my curriculum was still focused on a Western idea of what constituted music theory and proceeded through a Western major scale centered learning sequence. Decentering whiteness is at the core of these pedagogies, which aim for, as Paris and Aleem write, pluralist outcomes that are not centered on white middle class, monolingual, monocultural norms and notions of educational achievement. Going forward, we should explore how asset pedagogy could contribute to the rethinking of the goals of the theory curriculum, and in particular, how we can use these pedagogies to sustain the non-Western cultural practices of our students. Thank you, and again, here is the QR code to access the bibliography and class materials.
The floor is now open for questions.
All right, great paper. One thing I was thinking about when you said taking the box notation and translating that into staff notation, did you ever think about combining the two? So like having the beats at the top and then the empty boxes, having staff lines midway through before you make that like the big jump just to staff notation. The only reason I asked that is because I had the same issue. A lot of my students knew GarageBand and things like that. So I just took staff lines. I didn't do your approach like exactly, but taking staff lines and then dividing them up so it looks like a DAW. So essentially they're still writing X's in, and then when you translate the staff notation, you could just have the notes there, but they're still following those divisions. They're not bar lines, but they're like bar lines, I guess.
Right, that's a great idea. Totally a great idea. Yeah, the real issue with rhythm is the durational symbols and showing that against the beats. So anything that was able to graphically show that would work really well. It's a great idea.
More questions? Okay, well, I have a question. For some smaller schools, a lot of remedial things are taught through SI and by a different instructor than that of the main course, I guess. I was wondering how using box notation in the remedial course, how you would communicate that with the main instructor and how you could maybe work together on that. How would you do that?
So I'm generally the instructor for theory. So, we have, and our program, our university has a ton of adjuncts. So, there's something like 10 people teaching in music theory, and there's 2 full-time faculty. So, the coordination of that would be something to really apply if we wanted to do this throughout the curriculum. But for this was like I had 1 semester teaching this course, and so it was my chance to kind of experiment and see how that worked. But that would be something we'd want to coordinate throughout the curriculum. Yeah, I mean, we don't technically use that, I think. So yeah, that was my kind of characterization of that. Yeah, yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Great presentation. This was wonderful. I taught oral skills at a community college for a while, and I think it would have been really nice to have this sort of template. That would have been super helpful. In terms of the sort of asset idea, have you found any bleed over in terms of the sorts of assets that these students bring to the table into the core curriculum? So like something I might imagine would be maybe these students would be more adept at identifying like frequency ranges of like this sound has more of 200 hertz and less of X or something like that. So have you found any ideas that could potentially change the rest of the sequence?
You know, that's another great idea. When I taught Theory 1, and I would have these kind of a mixed class of these music industry majors and our traditional music majors, I thought that was really valuable that these students were interacting together, and we would do projects that were based on kind of working with or analyzing music that you knew. Like that was kind of the thing. It was like thematic, like kind of like lyrically thematic based ideas of musical meaning, and then what are songs that you know that reflect that and write about how the music embodies that or the music shows that. And so in that circumstance, students were bringing in music from different genres and from their different backgrounds, and kind of having those discussions in that class, I thought was really valuable for all students. But I haven't looked at any kind of specific skills in a specific way that music industry majors might bring into the core curriculum.
Are there any additional questions? Okay, wonderful. Let's give a round of applause to Mr. Bullock. I want to give great thanks for all of our presenters during this session. At 3:15 in the Cook Recital Hall, 12 Tone will be giving their keynote speech, so please come to that. Thank you all for coming. Have a good day.